Our guest today is Adi Ignatius. Adi is the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review Group, where he oversees the editorial activities of the Harvard Business Review, HBR.org, and Harvard Business Review's book publishing unit. Prior to joining HBR in 2009, Adi was the #2 editor at Time, and prior to that, he was both Beijing bureau chief and Moscow bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. Harvard Business Review is celebrating its 100th anniversary, and Adi is with us today to talk about his book, HBR at 100, Harvard Business Review at 100, the most influential and innovative articles from Harvard Business Review's first century. So Adi, welcome to Everyday MBA. For your book, you studied Harvard Business Review's history all the way back to its first issue in 1922. What struck you most as you look back, and how can a historical perspective on business help us prepare for the future?
Yeah, so Kevin, look, it's great to be on, and I appreciate your interest in us and in this project. Ideas are funny things. There's a lot of rigor and a lot of science to what we publish. There isn't necessarily science in how it is adopted and when things are adopted. So it's interesting to see ideas that come and go and to see which ones become sort of common practice. I'm struck by something like, Michael Porter's great article on strategy, where he outlines the 5 forces of strategy. This is half a century old, and practically, and it remains probably the most studied text on strategy that's out there. They're newer theories, they're newer approaches, but that is still kind of bedrock for how do you think about this kind of stuff. Or Clay Christensen on disruptive innovation. There are adherents of his theory. There are detractors. This idea that if you're an incumbent, a lower level, disruption can come your way, and you would be smart not to, don't ignore it, because that's how new competition comes in. So, say what you will about the theory, it's the only business book Steve Jobs says he ever read, and it's Jeff Bezos made every one of his managers read that article and that book too. So it's just interesting. You can't predict how ideas will take hold, but a few of them have really changed the landscape of business over the 100 years.
Did you find any early precursors to some of the current trends that we're experiencing today, say like environmental sustainability or social issues, for example, when you studied the HBR archives?
So absolutely. I mean, so if you define ESG, and look, ESG has its own issues and problems, but if you define it essentially as paying attention to a broad range of stakeholders, and figuring out how to try to measure and enforce that, then yeah, there are absolutely precedents that go way back. I mean, this is a new argument, but it's also not a new argument. So, in the 30s, you had influential thinkers arguing that corporations had to pay attention to a broad range of, they didn't use the term stakeholders then. Later, you had CSR, corporate social responsibility. I mean, that phrase was coined in the 1950s. So, in some ways it feels new, this idea that businesses have to do more than just make money for their shareholders. But the conversations have been going on for a long time.
Interesting, things change, but they tend to remain the same. From your perspective, not only looking back at the last 100 years of business, but also from your position really at the pulse of business today, what trends and conditions that you are witnessing will most shape the future of business? What is changing?
So to me, the most interesting moment that we're in right now is so this gets back to what we were just talking about, how ideas take hold. So, in the 1970s and 80s, kind of theories about maximizing shareholder value took hold. So you had articles by Michael Jensen and others in HBR and elsewhere that really had this appealing simplicity that managers can't maximize everything. Number one. Number two, that there was a concern that managers and owners were not aligned in kind of their priorities. So this theory came about that Jensen really gets credit for, Jensen is co-author, that was really the way you align these things is by just making it clear the primacy of shareholder value. And how do you make that happen? How do you align the values between the owner and the manager? Well, in part by things like stock options, so that everybody is aligned that share price is the maximum good. Now that this is just an idea, and as I was saying, there were counter arguments to that even before this was laid out, and yet it took hold. Milton Friedman became a champion of this. If you ask most CEOs for the past 50 years, they would say not only are they about maximizing shareholder value, they have no choice. They're legally required to do so. They're not legally required to maximize each quarter's share price. That's a fad. That's a trend. That's not the law. And yet, this idea was kind of so simple and so powerful that it dominated the business landscape for 50 years. Now, you're talking about looking forward. So what's interesting to me is we're in a different place right now. And there is
Big
real
time.
pressure for companies, for CEOs to think about stakeholders more broadly. So we have people who are thinking about the kind of ideological underpinning of that. So what is the theory of stakeholder capitalism? Again, maximizing shareholder value had this appealing simplicity. Um, Stakeholder capitalism seems more complicated, but rather than this being this kind of a haphazard, everybody approaches this in a different way. I think in the coming years we'll try to come up with a theory and try to figure out how do you measure these externalities that companies
Mm.
create that maybe they need to be responsible for, and maybe data and technology will allow us to do that and track that better. So to my mind, that's some of the most exciting stuff that I think is surely out there. I don't know what the next phase of capitalism is, but I feel it will be different from the past 50 years.
What is your advice for leaders from your perspective? What can they learn from your book? What leadership lessons should they learn from the archive that should influence their leadership style moving forward?
Well, one thing I hope people get from the book is that HBR isn't daunting. I mean, I think there are plenty of people out there who think Harvard Business Review is too dry or too technical or too specialized. And as I look at this collection of articles, it's really about how people interact, specifically in the workplace. But so over the years, we're dealing with a lot of the kind of soft issues, so, how managers interact with employees, how to think about things like, work-life balance, how to be emotionally intelligent. So, I hope people would find these ideas like, yeah, that touches my life, that this isn't just for some, you know, corner office lifelong learner nerd, but that this has sort of broad value. Um, as for leaders themselves, look, there are some people who would not read, some CEOs who would not read an article in HBR elsewhere to save their life. It's just not how they learn. It's not how they lead. And
Mm.
then there is this category of people we call lifelong learners who are always looking
Mm.
for ideas based on research. I mean, that's what we promise. Practical value, that's what we also promise. Um, so I guess my advice would be if you're that kind of person, pick up the magazine. Maybe something will surprise you that it doesn't necessarily answer a question that you have immediately, but that there's a lot of interesting research out there.
We are here with Adi Ignatius. Adi is the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review Group, and Harvard Business Review is celebrating its 100th anniversary. Adi is with us to talk about his book, HBR at 100, the most influential and innovative articles from Harvard Business Review's first century. Adi, the most influential and innovative articles from HBR in the first 100 years, that is quite a collection. You've mentioned some, but is there one article that you feel is particularly noteworthy that we should be looking at, and what can we learn from it?
Well, I mean, the article that spoke to me as much as any other was an article by Clay Christensen, who I'm sure your listeners know well, but it wasn't about disruptive innovation. It was an article called, How Will You Measure Your Life? And Clay applied some of the discipline of his thinking on disruptive innovation and everything else that he studied to sort of himself in his life. It was the course that he would teach at the end of every year. He and his students would all sort of end up in tears because it was very personal and very moving. And simple things that you think about. I mean, I remember one off the top of my head where Clay just said, it's easy. it's easier to do the right thing 100% of the time than 98% of the time. That
Mm.
once you slip, it's over. So I found that, especially from a guy like Clay, who enjoyed so much respect, lived such a big and generous life. It was a nice little blueprint for trying to get certain things in your own life aligned.
I want to ask you about your work as an editor. You oversee the editorial activities of HBR, hbr.org, and book publishing unit. You're also the host of the HBR channel. How do you go about your job as an editor of seeking out the business ideas, the best business ideas, and separating them from the rest?
Well, the secret for me is I have a great team of editors, and I don't mean that in some, blandly modest way. It's just, I've got a team of editors who really specialize. They're not experts in the various topics we cover, but they know the canon, they know what's out there, they know what the new thinking is. So, some of our acquisition of articles and authors is proactive, some of it is passive, that things kind of arrive in our mailbox. And I've got this team of people who have the ability to look at a piece on strategy or marketing or AI or what have you and really size it up. Number one, is this new? Number two, is this important? And number three, is it well written? And then number four, does it have practical value? And we know HBR is nobody's first read. It's probably nobody's second or even third read. So that when they turn to HBR, we have to deliver value. Not just something interesting and intriguing, but something that also offers a kind of practical, immediate takeaway if it's something that's relevant and of interest to you.
Prior to joining Harvard Business Review, you were the number two editor at Time. Why was the Harvard Business Review the right next move for you?
So yeah, if you look at my resume, this job is the outlier. I mean, I was a foreign correspondent for years. I
Right.
was in Moscow, as you said earlier, I was in Beijing. I've never loved a job more than this one, and
Mm.
I think I was hired because there was a realization that HBR needed to modernize, that it needed an editor with the metabolism more of a journalist than an academic who could help, figure out ways to get our ideas out to a broader reader base. It's sort of what I was saying before, that HBR ideas don't need, we don't have to be daunting, and
Right.
and 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 you don't define quality just by length, that you're actually serving up stuff long, short, digital, audio, video. We have a TikTok channel. I mean, just finding different
Mhm.
channels to provide information for people in different ways. On my best days, I feel like we can change the world for the better, that we edit more than write. We don't have in-house writers, so what we publish reflects the thinking of an academic or a consultant or an executive or whoever's writing the piece. But we do have a few values that we think are proven in terms of generating long-term commercial success. And they're things like sustainability, diversity, kind of fact-based decision making, long-term thinking. And these aren't just sort of woke values of the moment. That there's research that really makes it clear that if you pay attention to these, they have positive long-term effects. So, in that sense, by having those kind of unspoken pillars, I hope we're publishing stuff that
Mm.
is helping companies be more successful, but also maybe helping the world to be a better place.
You mentioned sustainability, diversity, fact-based. Uh, these are concerns that may or may not be manifesting themselves in our world today, our society today. Can business lead the way? Can business change the world for better in these ways?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's such the question of the moment. Those values I would have said were non-controversial and universal,
Right.
10 years ago, and now it seems like there's no such thing as an uncontroversial uh,
Yeah.
view on anything. Um, Look, I think a lot of us are frustrated with governments. They're frustrated with NGOs. I'm a very idealistic person. I want to see positive change happen, and it's not happening. That should happen through legislation, and most of us feel that the legislative bodies aren't working very effectively. So then we turn to businesses. Um, you know, in an ideal world, that doesn't quite seem right, that business should be tasked with solving societal problems. On the other hand, if they're not getting fixed anywhere, at the very least, businesses have the ability within that ecosystem that they control, a company or an organization or a huge corporation, to try to get it right on some of these things, to try to represent diversity, to try to make commitments to sustainability, um, to try to serve a broad range of stakeholders, and not including shareholders, absolutely, but not just shareholders. So if that happens, then you would imagine these ecosystems become, better places, that change happens pocket by pocket by pocket. I don't want to
Mm.
overstate it, and a lot of these same businesses that are trying to do the right thing in certain areas are also fighting for the lowest possible, tax payments, which further keeps legislatures from
Well,
working effectively. So I'm
right.
not I'm not going crazy, but we are at a moment where we're looking, where many of us are looking for sort of positive impact, and in some ways, companies, can, and it feels like even should, rise to the occasion.
Can, should, and in many cases maybe must in order to remain competitive. I mean, you mentioned pocket by pocket. I think that's an interesting way of putting it. When the altruistic or the social needs of customers and stakeholders align with the profitability possibilities for organizations, I think that's kind of a sweet spot. So that we have the best of both worlds, doing good and doing well at the same time. Do you feel that that is our our future moving forward?
I mean, certainly there are people who have tried to make that case, who've published an HBR about that. Conscious capitalism movement is one, and there are others. Um, yeah, I mean, this period right now where employees seem to have more agency, seem to be able to make more choices. Maybe if the recession gets worse, we'll think that's a quaint concept, but they do, and they seem increasingly to want to work for companies that represent their own values. That seems like an important point. Number two, just the rise of social media, Twitter, and other things means, as these things happen, the sort of Twitter mobs will interpret a company's response to big social or even political issues, so that silence isn't even an option anymore, because the Twitter mob will interpret that silence in one way or the other. So it almost forces companies and CEOs to be in the arena. And then increasingly, people want to buy from companies that share their values. So all of that kind of puts this stuff in play. And yeah, it goes from whether the question is should to companies must. I mean, they really, in order to align with their employees and even their customer base, they have to figure out where they stand on certain issues. And it's not really what any CEO wants to do, but it's just harder to avoid that now for the reasons I listed.
We have been speaking with Adi Ignatius. Adi is the editor-in-chief at the Harvard Business Review, and we're talking about his book, HBR at 100, the most influential and innovative articles from Harvard Business Review's first century. Adi, it's been great speaking with you today. We're almost out of time, but before I let you go, one last question. We've been looking back, say, in chunks of 100 years and looking forward, but what about the immediate future? What should executives and business owners and all of us really be thinking about now and strategizing for today in order to be prepared for the world in 5 years' time?
Well, this isn't an original thought, but it's I think it's the thing, and that is agility, just kind of extreme agility that I think most of us think about the past few years, COVID, new outbreaks of war in various places, social justice movement launched by, the murder of George Floyd and other things. It's just feeling like, wow, it's just sort of wave after wave after wave. I don't think that will ever dissipate. I think we're just in a world, and maybe it's because of interconnectedness. I don't know why, but I just think leaders have to just be agile, that there may not be periods where you just think, wow, okay, I can just kind of cruise and do what I'm doing. And that means you need to hire for that. That means you need to hire people who are able to go with the shift in strategy that has to happen because some of these external events are changing your market. So, um, I think it's pretty well understood, but I think there's certain companies that are hiring, they shifted the skills for which they hire from technical skills to more of a sort of psychological adaptability quotient or something like that. And
Mm.
that is really necessary because it's just things are things are going to keep kind of changing in a way. It will seem that it's more and more, more and more rapid. So I think that's the skill above all that both leaders and people who are vying for a job need to work on.
That is Adi Ignatius. Find him at hbr.org and get his book, HBR at 100, the most influential and innovative articles from Harvard Business Review's First Century. Adi, thank you so much for being our guest today on Everyday MBA.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.